Okay, so I want you to picture a profession for a second. Imagine a group of highly trained scientists, researchers, practitioners.
Right.
Their entire reason for existing, their whole raison d'etre, is to improve worker well-being and make organizations, run better. They study stress, leadership, fairness, all of it.
Sounds like the good guys of the corporate world. I mean, the people looking out for the human element in the whole machine.
Exactly. But here's the massive, just glaring contradiction that we stumbled upon in the research for today. This field, industrial organizational psychology,
Or IOPsych for short, yeah.
biopsych,
Yep.
it claims to be the champion of worker well-being. Yet for over a century, it has systematically ignored and sometimes actively fought against the one institution designed to do the exact same thing.
All right, we're talking about organized labor. We're talking about unions.
It turns out the science of work and the movement of workers have been like two ships passing in the night.
Well, yeah.
If one of those ships was actively pretending the other one didn't even exist?
Or, to kind of stretch the metaphor, if one ship was secretly selling torpedoes to the ocean to sink the other ship.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a really heavy-hitting piece of analysis called Bridging the Divide, IO psychology and organized labor. And I'd have to say, this isn't just some academic history lesson.
But
This feels like a critique of how we understand the whole modern workplace.
it absolutely is. The authors are essentially holding up a mirror to their own profession and asking how. How did we miss this?
So the mission for this deep dive is clear. We need to figure out why these two fields, psychology and unions, have been estranged for 100 years. We need to look at the consequences of this benign neglect, which is a very polite way of putting
A
it.
very polite way.
And we need to see how fixing this broken relationship could actually change the future of work.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the timing here is just critical.
Hmm.
Public approval of unions in the U.S. is hovering around 64%. That is a 50-year high. You see organizing drives at Starbucks, Amazon, Apple, video game developers. I mean, there's a fundamental shift happening in how people view their relationship with employers.
And yet the psychologists, the supposed experts on work, are what? Nowhere to be found.
Conspicuously absent. The source argues that bridging this gap is a scientific imperative. Basically, if you claim to be the science of work, you cannot scientifically justify ignoring the institutions that represent, 10 to 35% of the workforce. It's bad data.
That's the part I couldn't wrap my head around. How does a field about people at work just ignore a third of the workforce? I mean, where does that bias even come from? It feels so intentional.
Well, to understand the silence, you have to look at the noise from the very beginning.
Yeah.
We have to go back to the origins of the field in the early 20th century. The relationship is, well, it's best described as mutual estrangement, but the source makes it pretty clear that IO psychology sort of started the fight by picking a side.
They picked a side that signed the checks.
Essentially, yes. Early industrial psychologists were desperate for legitimacy. You have to remember, psychology was a brand new science back then. They wanted to be seen as real scientists, like physicists or chemists. So they aligned themselves with the people who held the keys to the factories, the owners and managers.
Right. They aligned with the so-called efficiency movements.
Me.
This is the era of Taylorism, right?
Yeah.
Assembly lines, stopwatches, squeezing every single ounce of productivity out of a human being.
Precisely. And the source mentions a founding figure, a guy named Hugo Münsterberg. He didn't just ignore unions. He actually consulted for companies specifically to help them implement strategies to keep unions out.
So it wasn't just, we don't study this. It was literally, we are here to stop this.
He viewed the union as an obstacle to the perfect, efficient machine he was trying to build. And it got even more aggressive in the 1920s and 30s. Psychologists would provide testimony framing collective action like strikes or unionizing as economically irrational.
Wow.
They even called it psychologically primitive.
Psychologically primitive, that is. Unbelievably patronizing. It sounds like they were pathologizing the desire for better pay.
That's exactly what they were doing. They were framing resistance as a mental defect or some emotional outburst, not a legitimate grievance about working conditions. And that attitude hardened into what the source calls the unitary view of the workplace. This became the default assumption after World War II.
Unitary view. That sounds like a piece of jargon, but it basically means we're all one big happy family, right?
It's the assumption that management and employees always share the same interests. We're all paddling the boat in the same direction. In that worldview, conflict is a dysfunction. If workers are unhappy, it's not because there's a genuine power imbalance or wages are too low. It's because communication failed or, we need
True.
better leadership training.
So if the baseline assumption is we all want the same thing, then a union looks like an intruder.
Exactly. If the system is perfect, the union is a glitch. They were viewed as an impediment to efficiency or just a symptom of management failure. If you have a union, it just means the manager's messed up somewhere along the line.
And that legacy has stuck around. Because we're talking about stuff from the 40s. Surely in the 2020s, the science has caught up.
You would think so, but the data says otherwise. The authors analyzed the flagship journals of the field, the most prestigious places to publish research. And between the years 2000 and 2020, fewer than 2% of articles even addressed unions or collective bargaining.
2% over 20 years. That is just wild. Considering how much news coverage labor gets, the gig economy, the Hollywood strikes, the scientists are just ignoring it.
It's a structural blindness. The authors identify a few key drivers. First, follow the money. Corporations fund the research, they hire the practitioners, and they provide access to the data.
Yeah, if I'm a CEO paying for a study, I probably don't want you researching why my workers want to organize against me. I want you to tell me how to make them work harder or, be happier with what they already have.
Precisely. And then there's the microfocus.
Yeah.
IO psychology loves to look at the individual traits, personality tests, performance reviews.
Right.
It tends to ignore the broad power dynamics.
Yeah.
It treats the worker like an island.
And I'm guessing the education system just reinforces all this?
Completely. Fewer than 15% of doctoral programs in this field have any coursework at all on labor relations. So you have these experts graduating with PhDs in work, and they've effectively never studied the institutions that represent the actual workers.
That is a massive gap in expertise. So, okay, let's pivot. We've established the bias. We know they ignored the unions. But so what? I mean, how does this actually play out for the person swiping their badge on a Tuesday morning?
This is where the rubber really meets the road. The source distinguishes between two types of voice in the workplace. There's what they call individual voice and then collective voice.
Individual voice is, what, the suggestion box?
Yep. Suggestion boxes, employee engagement surveys, open-door policies. IO psychology loves these things. And to be fair, they are valuable for incremental improvements. Hey, the coffee machine is broken, or we need better lighting.
But you can't exactly put a note in the suggestion box saying, I think we're all underpaid and the safety standards are illegal.
You can, but it is incredibly risky. That's the distinction. Individual voice is high risk for high-stakes issues. If you complain alone, you could be labeled a troublemaker or, not a team player.
Right.
Collective voice, through grievance procedures, wage bargaining, it allows workers to speak up about these fundamental power issues without the same fear of retaliation.
Because there's safety in numbers.
And legal protection. By focusing only on individual voice, the field basically leaves workers vulnerable when it comes to the really heavy stuff.
This brings me to a part of the article that was a real aha moment for me. They talk about the resilience trap. This felt so relevant to the modern corporate world where everyone's being told to just practice mindfulness.
It's probably the most damning critique in the whole paper, in my opinion.
So, okay, IO psychology often prescribes resilience training. Here's how to breathe through the stress, or let's reframe your anxiety about layoffs.
Right. If a worker is stressed about job insecurity, worrying they might get fired tomorrow, the psychological intervention is often, let's help you cope with that fear. It puts the entire burden of adjustment on the worker's psyche.
Whereas the union intervention is,
Let's get a contract that says you can't be fired without just cause.
wow!
Wow.
That is such a stark difference. One is breathing exercises, the other is a legal contract. It feels almost like gaslighting to tell someone to be resilient when the problem is structural. It's like, don't worry about the fire, just meditate on the warmth.
That is the core argument. If the roof is leaking, you don't teach people to enjoy the rain. You fix the roof. And the source uses the COVID-19 pandemic as a really brutal example of this.
Oh, that stood out to me. The difference in how safety was handled in those early, really scary months.
The data shows that unionized workers in healthcare and logistics, they secured significantly better PPE, hazard pay, and safety protocols.
Sure.
And why? Because they had collective bargaining power. They could actually say, we aren't working unless we have masks.
And meanwhile, the psychologists were doing what?
Well, the literature from that time shows the field was heavily focused on remote work adjustment and individual stress management.
Which is important. I don't want to dismiss that. I definitely needed stress management back then.
Oh, it is important. But it largely ignored how collective action was the thing actually keeping people physically safe in factories and hospitals. It's just a blind spot. The field claims to care about safety, but then ignores the mechanism, the union, that actually enforces safety.
And we can't talk about worker well-being without talking about the paycheck. The article mentions the union wage premium.
Yep, typically 10 to 15%. And just as important, unions compress wage inequality, meaning the gap between the highest and lowest paid is smaller. And we know from decades of psychological research that financial security is a huge predictor of mental health and job satisfaction.
So if you care about mental health, which these psychologists absolutely claim to do, you should logically care about the institutions that secure higher wages.
It seems so obvious when you lay it out like that, doesn't it? But ideology can be a powerful blinder.
Okay, I want to pivot because the article isn't just a list of complaints. It actually offers a way out of this. And frankly, here's where it gets really interesting.
It is very constructive. It's not just burn it all down. It's here's how we build the bridges.
It talks about what happens when these two sides actually stop fighting and start, collaborating. They call it bridging the divide.
And it starts with research, specifically something called participatory action research.
Which is a fancy academic term. Can you break that down for us?
It just means treating workers as partners in the research design, not as subjects. Usually, a researcher comes in, observes the lab rats, collects data, and writes a report for the boss.
Right.
Participatory action research says, let's ask the workers what the problems are, and let's design the solution together with them.
And the classic example they use here is Kaiser Permanente. I love this case study.
It's the gold standard.
Yeah.
So Kaiser is this massive healthcare system. In the late 90s, they were basically at war with their unions. It was ugly. But they decided to try something radical, a labor management partnership.
And this covered something like 85,000 workers. That is huge.
Massive scale. And instead of psychologists coming in and telling management how to fix things, they created unit-based teams. These were small groups of frontline workers, nurses, technicians, janitors, and their managers working together to solve local problems.
So if a ward is inefficient, you don't call in some outside consultant. You ask the nurses on that ward.
Exactly. But here's the key. They used IO psychologists to facilitate those teams. The psychologists brought the data skills, the metrics, the meeting structures. The workers brought the on-the-ground knowledge of the job.
And the outcome wasn't just workers are happier. The patient care actually got better. Mortality rates literally dropped.
Because the people doing the work know where the problems are. When you combine that tacit worker knowledge with the methodological expertise of psychologists, you get better outcomes for everyone. It really is a win-win.
Speaking of win-win, let's talk about bargaining. Because usually when we think of contract negotiations, we think of people, banging on tables, strike threats, yelling until 4 in the morning.
That's distributive bargaining, the idea that the pie is fixed. For me to get a bigger slice, you have to get a smaller one. It's a zero-sum game.
But the source argues it doesn't have to be that way.
Well, think about the skill set of a psychologist. They are experts in conflict resolution, negotiation, decision-making. The article argues they should be in the room, not to help management crush the union, but as neutral facilitators.
And this isn't just a theory. They mention AT&T and the CWA union.
Correct. The Communications Workers of America. They've actually used neutral facilitators, sometimes psychologists, to help prepare for bargaining. They use what are called integrative bargaining techniques.
Integrative. That means expanding the pie.
Exactly. It's looking for creative options where both parties get what they actually need. Maybe the company needs flexibility in scheduling, and the workers need predictability for childcare. A psychologist can help facilitate that dialogue to find a solution that works for both, rather than just fighting over a single wage number.
It just seems like such a better use of psychological expertise than designing another personality test for hiring.
It leverages the core skills of the profession to solve the hardest problems. And there are even more radical examples. The source talks about workplace democracy.
This is where we get into the stuff that feels very European to American ears.
It often is. They cite the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. It's a massive federation of worker cooperatives.
So the workers actually own the company.
They do. And they elect worker councils to run it. But here's the thing. Democracy is hard. Just because you vote doesn't mean you know how to read a balance sheet or run a strategic planning meeting or navigate group dynamics.
That's true. I've been in enough HOA meetings to know that democracy can be very messy.
Right. So at Mondragon and also at the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, they use organizational psychologists to support those worker councils. They train them in decision-making, in financial literacy, in group dynamics.
So they're helping the workers be better bosses of themselves.
In a sense,
Yeah.
yeah. They're helping the democratic process function efficiently. It challenges the whole idea that democracy is inefficient. It shows that with the right support, psychological support, democratic firms can be incredibly effective.
There was one other area where I thought the potential for collaboration was huge, and that's DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because every company on Earth has a DEI statement now.
This is a critical point. IO psychology is very focused on DEI right now. It's a major trend. But the source points to a study by the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union in Healthcare.
This was the study comparing union versus non-union contracts on discrimination.
Yes, they found that the union contracts had much stronger anti-discrimination language and, really importantly, better wage compression across racial groups than the non-union facilities.
So while a company might have a diversity training seminar, which is nice, the union contract was actually closing the racial pay gap.
Precisely. The key takeaway here is that collective power can sometimes achieve equity outcomes that training alone simply cannot. If you want to fix systemic inequality, you need systemic power. And that's what unions provide. Psychologists who care about DEI should be looking at collective bargaining as a tool in their toolkit.
So if all these solutions exist, if we can have these partnerships and better bargaining and better equity, why isn't it happening everywhere? What's the path forward?
Well, it requires fixing that benign neglect. And the source lays out a pretty clear roadmap for reform.
It starts with school, right? You have to catch them young.
You do. We have to update graduate curriculums. You can't send practitioners out into the world who are completely blind to 10% of the workforce. They need to understand labor law, labor history, collective dynamics.
And the funding issue, that one seems harder to crack.
That's the harder one, for sure. We need to diversify funding. If all the research is paid for by management, the results are always going to tilt toward management. We need public interest research centers or even union-funded research to balance the scales.
And finally, there's the issue of neutrality. The article makes a really important distinction here. They're not asking every psychologist to put on a Union Yes t-shirt and start picketing.
No, and that is so important. The goal isn't political activism, it's scientific objectivity. True neutrality doesn't mean defaulting to the management perspective, which is what happens now.
Right. Ignoring the union isn't neutral. It's taking the boss's side by default.
Exactly. True neutrality means acknowledging the power asymmetry in the room. It means asking, who does this intervention help? And who might it harm? It means expanding the ethical code to acknowledge that sometimes the client shouldn't just be the person signing the check, but the hundreds of people actually doing the work.
It's about being a complete scientist, not just a partial one.
That's the scientific imperative we started with at the top.
So we've covered the history, the consequences, and the potential for a really exciting collaboration. But as we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with something to chew on.
I think the most provocative thought to leave with is about how we view conflict. We spend so much time in our work lives and in psychology trying to fix conflict. We treat it like a disease or a failure of culture. We think, oh, if we just communicated better, we'd all agree.
But that's not really true, is it?
No. Workers want security and higher wages. Owners want flexibility and higher profits. That is a conflict. But it's not a failure. It's a reality. It's a legitimate difference in interests.
So instead of trying to suppress that conflict or train it away,
we should manage it. Manage it through collective institutions. The source suggests that if we accept conflict as legitimate and we use tools like unions to manage it, we might actually make our organizations stronger, more resilient, and a lot more honest.
that is a powerful shift. Instead of pretending we all want the same thing, let's build a table where we can negotiate the things we don't agree on.
And maybe, just maybe, the psychologists can help build that table.
So for you listening, whether you're a manager, a worker, a student, or just someone interested in how the world works, look at your own workplace. Do you have a suggestion box? Or do you have a seat at the table? And what's the difference in how those two things feel?
It's a question worth asking.
Thanks for diving deep with us today. We'll see you next time.